Okay, Scott Cox here with Interface Coaching. Pick up where we left off with this chart. The percentage of VO2 max that we're training at, the intensity, and the type of muscle fibers we're recruiting. Just keep in mind that VO2 max can increase quite a bit with time and training, years actually, and we can change these fiber types or how these fibers act. There's a debate there, but with consistent training over time, we can influence how these fibers use fat or glycogen for fuel, and so on. So when we're thinking of training, I like to think of this chart as basically if I know the athlete's current physiology and then training intensity, then we have a pretty good idea of what signal we're sending and what we can likely expect the adaptations to be for an athlete. We'll start with a sprinter today. I think that's a common amateur type athlete type, because they're just not as good aerobically, or maybe they're just new to the sport. So I see that quite a bit. And I think there's some nuances to training as a sprinter that I think get missed. I know for me, when early on with some coaches, we took a balanced approach, and I definitely learned some things and some gains. I think there were some things that just didn't make sense to me, training wise, and it's led me down the road, to learn physiology and interest in these things. And there's some things that might be a little counterintuitive. So hopefully some things that have helped me that I've figured out and used with other athletes successfully will help you. But we look at the phenotype, and so over here is 5 seconds. This is, a profile on how I stack up against the masses. So 5 seconds, so neuromuscular power. 1 minute's going to be anaerobic ability. 5 minutes is going to be, VO2 max or maximal aerobic capacity, and then threshold out here. And we look at how these systems relate to each other to come up with a phenotype. So this can change quite a bit. So the all-rounder is kind of flat across the top. The sprinter is going to be good up here and then come down and be not so good out here. Pursuiter is good in here, and then our time trialist is good out here. So anyway, we can change this quite a bit, but I think it's good to check in on these energy systems so we see how these things relate. As I might be, training, I can get really good here, but then this suffers enough and I can't get to the end of the race. So even though this is improved, net result is, I'm not racing better. Or same with the sprint, maybe the sprint improves quite a bit, but usually that's going to impact out here, and there might be diminishing returns there. So we want to think about how our body's working at a time, and I might find that backing this down a little bit and get in here, that might improve these areas, and then I'm going to race better. So anyway, we're always just think about being balanced. I think there's a lot of focus on threshold. It's part of it, but we want to think about some other things, to being a successful racer. We can get into this chart here. This is the anaerobic and aerobic contribution. So this is for my data here. Again, you can see I'm all-rounder currently based on the data it has. And this is my power duration curve in red. The blue is my anaerobic ability, and then the green's my aerobic ability, or what those systems are contributing to this overall power. So if you add these up, they turn into this red line here. And then this also weighs in what my threshold is, and then my anaerobic ability currently and sprint power. They all interplay together. That's why I like WKO5, and it's good to double check with some other things that are out there. Or you could just do the field testing and look at your 5 second, 1 minute, 5 minute, 20 minute, and get close enough. But I'm interested in how those things are changing as a coach. And I look at the contribution. So at 10 minutes, I'm 87% aerobic and 13% anaerobic. We'll get into that in a minute, but that's how I use this chart to help determine training intensities and durations. We'll get into that, some common workouts here. We have the long slow ride, tempo, SFRs, muscle tension intervals, strength endurance work. So low cadence, tempo-ish kind of power. Sweet spot, and then your intensive aerobic or FTP intervals. We'll start with those. We'll also go over these micro intervals, so VO2 max intervals, the 30-15s, or the long intervals, 4x4s, some big gear work, and then max efforts with full recoveries and some training concepts. But we'll dive into this aerobic side for this athlete. So for me, if I'm going to go for a 4-hour ride, I'm probably going to target 175 watts ish. I think that's enough. I can ride at 200 watts. I don't think I need to. I'm trying to improve my VO2 max. I'm trying to. This is a great VO2 max builder. I think it's a great strategy for a sprinter type that's trying to stay a sprinter type. And basically, you're not including a lot of fast twitch fibers, so we're not influencing either way, and we can recover from this kind of work. So this is a classic ride for anybody. The thing to keep in mind is the longer you ride, you're going to fatigue your muscle fibers. So there's going to be a point here somewhere where your fast twitch fibers start to get recruited more because your slow twitch fibers have had it, and that might have a negative impact on your sprint. But I'm all about aerobic development and trying to get the highest VO2 max possible, and I think this is a classic ride where you want to do that. And you, as a sprinter, you might find 3 hours is all that you can do without losing sprint power, or maybe you have to look at your overall volume. But in general, sprinters can't train as much each week because there's more, you're using more of these fibers because you have more of these in theory, and they fatigue more. So that dictates how much you can actually handle in training. So that's another thing right there, is how long your ride should be and many hours you're putting in a week. Sprinters is generally going to be lower. I think there's a lot of world tour sprinters that probably put in about 15 hours a week on average. If we get into tempo, it's going to be 250 watts ish. Again, it's largely aerobic, but we're starting to recruit these fibers here and we're influencing these. So that's going to maybe help your threshold by making them more aerobic, but that could also hurt your sprint. So if you're doing a lot of tempo work, we're talking a lot. You can do a little, it's not going to impact much. But if you're doing, tempo day in and day out, you're probably going to hurt your sprint power. And maybe that's good. Maybe you need your sprint to take a little hit so that your threshold comes up and you race better. Or maybe your goal events are much more reliant on aerobic abilities, so it makes a case for that. But I think as a sprinter, I'd want to know what's happening at tempo. And I see a lot of things right now. This coronavirus is going to base, ride tempo. And I'm like, well, if you're a sprinter, I wouldn't do a lot of that probably, unless you need to. So when you're starting to ride tempo, you're influencing those fast twitch fibers quite a bit. That's same thing's going to happen at your sweet spot here, and then also at right around threshold. The other thing of note for me as a rider, I think there's a lot of riders that I see like me, is a threshold's not that high, but our time to exhaustion is quite long. So to actually strain the aerobic system, if you're trying to improve threshold and abilities, you generally need to ride a little bit longer at these lower power levels. So if you're doing high power, shorter intervals, you're not straining your aerobic system near as much. And I think when you see the time trialist and other examples, you'll see how a 10-minute interval might make a lot of sense to improve their aerobic abilities. And whereas the sprinter type all-rounder or strong anaerobic rider, if that's your goal, you might want to do longer intervals in general. As you can see, if we get into a 10-minute interval for me, it's 86% aerobic and 13% anaerobic. So if you're under 20% anaerobic, you're probably not doing much with your anaerobic system. And so, but I'm also creating a lot of fatigue. So if I'm doing 10-minute intervals, I'm going to create a lot of fatigue, and I'm not going to be able to, that's going to impact future training. Sprinters can't train a lot, right? We've already talked about that. And in general, maybe 2 times a week can be intense, and the other days have to be pretty easy. So you don't get many opportunities to train, so I'd be careful on which ones I pick. Whereas if I'm trying to improve my aerobic system and I do the 10-minute intervals, 87% aerobic. But what if I do, 30-minute intervals? Well, now I'm 95% aerobic. So for me, it's going to be less fatigue and more aerobic strain. So that sprinter, anaerobic type that's trying to improve aerobic abilities and doesn't care if they lose their sprint a little bit, then you're probably going to be in these longer durations out here. Then we talked about if you're doing the 30-15s or the 40-20s, that's real popular right now. Or maybe you do the long, VO2 intervals, this can be anywhere from 3 to 8 minutes. Which one would I choose? Well, we can come here and look at the energy contribution. So for prescribing power, like what power would you target for your 30 seconds on of the 30-15 micro intervals? I base things off of VO2 max for my athletes, but a good rule of thumb, if you don't have all that, would be what's your maximal 4-minute power, and use that as your power target. And so for me, that's 412 watts. I think that'd be pretty reasonable for what I could do. I mean, depending, you might be able to go a little higher than that. But let's look here. Now anaerobic's 27%. So I might be strengthening my anaerobic system, which is already quite strong, and I'm not getting a lot of aerobic strain. And I'm doing these intervals because I want to improve my maximal aerobic capacity, or my VO2 max. And so a lot of sprinter types and high anaerobic riders are good at on-off intervals anyway. So maybe this isn't the interval I would grab if I'm, doing general training. If we're doing, say, let's do 4-minute intervals for this athlete, I would probably target 6-minute power so that I can, repeat these intervals. So yeah, if I'm doing 4-minute intervals, I'm going to target 375 to 400 watts, and that's 80% aerobic and 20% anaerobic. So now maybe I'm maintaining my anaerobic system, but I'm strengthening my aerobic system. So maybe these 4-minute intervals at this power might be the ticket, or 6-minute intervals, or maybe even 8-minute intervals. And now I'm 84% aerobic, and so I'm really straining that aerobic system pretty maximally with max power. So that might be something to think about there. I think these 30-15s, they can improve anaerobic capacity. But I think for sprinter type, I wouldn't use a lot of these. Maybe the week, maybe the 2 weeks leading into racing, if you haven't raced at all and you haven't had any buffering, because part of it's psychological, or just getting your body used to that lactate tolerance, because you generate a lot of lactate and it accumulates. So there are some training benefits in here, beyond anaerobic ability and VO2 max, but I'd be using this sparingly. And I'd also think it's probably a strength of a sprinter anaerobic person already, and you're just training your strengths. So in general training, I believe in looking after the weaknesses, and I think these are probably going to be more challenging. That's your tell right there too. Like if you have a hard time with these, then maybe that makes a case for doing these longer intervals here. So for a lot of sprinters, just quickly, I'm going to probably do a lot of this easy riding, and then maybe more of this out here, and then keep an eye on what the sprint's doing. And maybe we're not doing a lot of this kind of work here, but then we can talk about overgeared starts and these maximal efforts. And looking at our chart here, of course now we're in this area over here, so it's highly anaerobic. The reason I wanted to talk about these overgear starts or track stands is, a sprinter anaerobic type generally they're quite powerful, and you can create a lot of torque. So yeah, there's benefit here to increase power on the bike, and maybe you need that at the end of the race. You have to look at, do I actually need power, or do I need to be fresher at the end of the race? And a coach can help you, or you can figure that out on your own, and you look at the data and try and take your bias out there. But it's a lot of wear and tear on your joints. So as a sprinter, if I do overgeared, big gear work, I can't do much of it, and then I'm also probably going to need to recover for a couple of days before I can train again. So every time we're doing intensity, we need to think about, how long is it going to take us to recover from that? That's the same with these, 20 to 60 second all-out efforts with full recoveries, which would be a 20-minute rest. So these are maximal. You find out, make as much power as you can. You're about falling off the bike at the end of 20 seconds or 60 seconds, and then you take a full recovery. These are to drive power up. So if you think that you're lacking power, you probably want to take this approach. Versus if you lack repeatability, you might consider this approach to get more capacity. But again, like if you're doing this kind of work and you're strong, sprinter or anaerobic ability, you can go quite deep here, and this might take you 3 or 4 days to climb out of. And so I'd look to see what I needed to do. I think on a training, just a racing front, a lot of sprinters, feel like, or there's a lot of racers actually that they report they can keep up with the accelerations out of corners and crits and things initially, but they can't keep up as the race progresses. So if you can get over that first hill, or you can keep up with the accelerations in sprints and things out of corners initially, I believe you already have the power to keep up. You're just lacking the conditioning, and that I'd argue strongly that you look more at aerobic development, as I think a lot of athletes get beat up a little bit, and I just don't have enough power in these on-off in crits, and they want to do a bunch of these 30-15s, and it might make sense for some athletes, maybe more the time trialer, but as sprinters, again, unless you're lacking power, then a lot of times it's just endurance. So I would look at endurance first. I feel quite strongly about that, and I've seen it time and time again. Athletes that are having trouble in races start focusing more on aerobic development. Then their sprint improves in a race because they can recover from things. Lower carb training is kind of a hot topic. As a sprinter, I would not do that. That's going to lower your, sprint ability. If you're trying to improve your threshold, you might consider that. Weight training, yes, I would do it, but again, that maybe means you can't train more because you're wear and tear on your body, but it can offset some of those aerobic signals. I think that weight training can help preserve your sprint. And then if we take a look at a week here, this is how I might structure that for a sprinter as a starting point, with a recovery spin and weights, then VO2. And I'm thinking about how much torque is done on each of these days and leg speed to minimize strain. So hopefully that helps you get started.